Inside your body, your arteries are listening. Every rise in blood sugar, every moment of inflammation, leaves a small mark on their delicate inner walls. For people living with diabetes, this quiet damage builds slowly, long before symptoms appear, turning flexible vessels into stiff, narrowed pathways. But the human body is not without defense. Nature has placed powerful protection inside simple foods, signals that calm inflammation, soften artery walls, and restore balance to the bloodstream. And among them, one humble nut speaks to the arteries more clearly than almost any other. When we speak about diabetes, we often speak as if the story begins and ends with sugar, numbers on a report, or a reading on a screen. But the deeper story unfolds far from the fingertip, inside the soft inner lining of the arteries, where blood meets living tissue. This lining, the endothelium, is not a passive surface. It senses pressure, responds to hormones, releases signals that tell vessels when to widen and when to tighten. In a healthy body, this system works quietly, almost invisibly, allowing blood to flow with ease. In diabetes, this conversation becomes strained. Excess glucose does not simply float by harmlessly. It disrupts signaling, increases oxidative stress, and slowly dulls the responsiveness of these delicate cells. As blood sugar remains elevated over time, the endothelium loses its ability to produce enough nitric oxide, a molecule essential for keeping arteries relaxed and open. Without it, vessels become tense, less flexible, more reactive. This is not an event but a process, happening day after day, meal after meal, often without pain or warning. The arteries are still open, but they are no longer at ease. This tension invites inflammation, and inflammation invites further damage, creating a cycle that quietly accelerates cardiovascular risk in people with diabetes. Here is where the role of certain fats becomes quietly revolutionary. Walnuts contain a rare plant-based omega-3 fat that the body recognizes not as a threat, but as a signal of repair. These fats integrate into cell membranes, including those of endothelial cells, making them more fluid, more responsive, more capable of restoring proper communication. Instead of forcing change, they soften resistance. Inflammation markers begin to lower, not dramatically, but steadily, as if the body is remembering a calmer state it once knew. Scientific observations show that omega-3 fatty acids influence gene expression within endothelial cells, encouraging the production of protective compounds while reducing signals that promote adhesion of inflammatory cells to artery walls. This matters deeply in diabetes, where damaged endothelium becomes sticky, attracting immune cells that worsen plaque development. Walnuts do not scrape arteries clean. They reduce the conditions that make arteries vulnerable in the first place. They shift the internal environment from hostile to supportive. There is also something profound in how these fats affect blood flow itself. Improved endothelial function allows arteries to dilate more effectively in response to increased demand, such as during walking or mild exertion. This means tissues receive oxygen more efficiently, and the heart works with less strain. Over time, this improved circulation becomes not just a cardiovascular benefit, but a metabolic one, supporting better glucose delivery and utilization at the cellular level. What makes this especially relevant for diabetes is that the damage to arteries is often disproportionate to outward symptoms. A person may feel fine while their vessels are slowly losing elasticity. Walnuts act early in the chain of events, before blockages form, before stiffness becomes permanent. They work in the realm of prevention and restoration, not emergency intervention. This aligns with how the body prefers to heal, gradually, through consistency rather than force. There is also an emotional dimension to this science. The idea that arteries respond to nourishment reminds us that the body is not an enemy to be controlled, but a partner that reacts to care. When healthy fats replace inflammatory ones, the bloodstream becomes less chaotic. Signals quiet down. Repair mechanisms activate. The endothelium begins to behave less like a battlefield and more like a well-governed border, regulating flow with intelligence and restraint. In this sense, walnuts do not simply support arteries. They restore trust between the blood and the vessel wall. They reduce friction at the most intimate interface of circulation, allowing the body to move away from constant defense. For someone living with diabetes, this subtle shift can mean the difference between arteries that age rapidly and arteries that retain their adaptability, responding gently to life's demands, remaining open to movement, nourishment. Cholesterol is often spoken about as if it were a single villain moving through the bloodstream, but in reality, it is a complex traveler whose behavior depends entirely on the environment it moves through. In a healthy metabolic state, cholesterol plays a vital role in building cell membranes, producing hormones, and supporting nerve function. The problem begins not with cholesterol itself, but with damage. In diabetes, persistent high blood sugar creates an oxidative environment, one rich in free radicals that alter the structure of LDL particles, turning them from neutral carriers into unstable and reactive forms. When LDL cholesterol becomes oxidized, it behaves differently. It is no longer simply passing through the arteries. It begins to interact with the vessel walls in ways that trigger alarm. The endothelium recognizes oxidized LDL as a threat, inviting immune cells to respond. These immune cells engulf the damaged particles and become foam cells, embedding themselves into the artery lining. Over time, this process forms the foundation of plaque. It is slow, silent, and deeply influenced by the chemical conditions inside the blood. Walnuts enter this story not by lowering cholesterol dramatically, but by changing the environment in which cholesterol exists. They are rich in polyphenol, plant-based antioxidant compounds that circulate alongside LDL particles, offering protection against oxidative damage. These compounds act like buffers, neutralizing free radicals before they can alter cholesterol's structure. In doing so, they preserve LDL in a less reactive, less inflammatory form. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it addresses the root of plaque formation rather than its aftermath. There is an elegance to this mechanism. Instead of forcing cholesterol levels down, walnuts reduce the likelihood that cholesterol will become harmful. This matters especially in diabetes, where oxidative stress is persistently elevated. By lowering oxidative pressure, walnuts reduce the chance that LDL will stick to artery walls, interrupting the early steps of atherosclerosis. The arteries become less attractive targets for plaque buildup, not because cholesterol disappears, but because it loses its damaging edge. Polyphenol in walnuts also influence inflammatory signaling. They reduce the expression of molecules that encourage immune cells to attach to the endothelium. Blood sugar is not only a number, it is a rhythm. In a healthy body, glucose rises and falls with a gentle, predictable tempo, allowing cells to receive energy without stress. In diabetes, that rhythm becomes sharp and uneven. Spikes arrive suddenly, flooding the bloodstream, and it is during these moments that the greatest harm occurs. Each rapid rise in glucose creates oxidative stress, damaging proteins, fats, and the delicate lining of blood vessels. Over time, it is not the presence of glucose alone that injures arteries, but the repeated shock of these surges. Walnuts interact with this rhythm in a quiet, stabilizing way. They contain a balance of fiber, healthy fats, and plant protein that slows digestion from the very first bite. When walnuts are eaten with or between meals, they delay gastric emptying, meaning carbohydrates enter the bloodstream more gradually. Glucose rises more slowly, peaks at a lower level, and declines with less drama. The bloodstream experiences calm instead of turbulence, and the arteries are spared the chemical stress of sudden sugar overload. This effect is especially important because blood sugar spikes are closely linked to endothelial damage. High glucose levels reduce nitric oxide availability and increase inflammation at the vessel wall. By softening these spikes, walnuts indirectly preserve the ability of arteries to relax and respond. The benefit is not dramatic in the moment, but cumulative over weeks and months. Each steadier rise is a small act of protection, repeated often enough to change long-term outcomes. There is also a deeper metabolic impact at play. Stable blood sugar supports better insulin signaling. When glucose enters the bloodstream slowly, insulin does not need to surge aggressively. Cells remain more sensitive to its message, and resistance develops less rapidly. Walnuts, through their low glycemic load, help reduce the constant demand placed on insulin-producing cells. This is not a cure, but it is relief, a lowering of metabolic strain that allows the system to function with greater efficiency. Fiber plays a particularly important role in this process. The fiber in walnuts feeds beneficial gut bacteria, which in turn produce compounds that improve glucose metabolism and reduce inflammation. This gut-blood vessel connection is often overlooked, yet it is critical. A healthier gut environment leads to fewer inflammatory signals entering the bloodstream, further protecting arteries from damage. The result is a quieter internal environment where glucose, lipids, and immune signals are better balanced. Another subtle benefit lies in how walnuts affect appetite and food choices. By promoting satiety, they reduce the likelihood of frequent snacking on refined carbohydrates that trigger sharp sugar spikes. This behavioral shift is not forced. It emerges naturally as the body feels more nourished. Fewer spikes mean fewer inflammatory events, and fewer inflammatory events mean slower progression of vascular damage. In this way, walnuts influence blood sugar not only through digestion, but through decision-making shaped by physiology. What makes this relationship profound is that it aligns with the body's preference for stability. Human biology is designed for gradual change, not extremes. Walnuts support this design by slowing the pace of glucose entry and exit, creating a metabolic environment that feels safe rather than urgent. Over time, this sense of safety allows repair mechanisms to function more effectively. Arteries are not constantly responding to crisis. They are allowed to maintain structure and flexibility. For someone living with diabetes, this steadying influence can mean fewer moments of invisible harm. Each controlled rise in blood sugar is a moment where oxidative stress does not spike, where endothelial cells remain intact, where the inner walls of arteries are spared another small injury. Accumulated over years, these spared moments shape the future of cardiovascular health, not through dramatic intervention, but through gentle, persistent regulation of the body's internal rhythm. Excess body fat is often discussed in terms of appearance or simple weight, but biologically, it behaves more like an active organ than a passive storage site. Especially in diabetes, fat tissue releases a steady stream of chemical messengers that influence insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and vascular health. When fat accumulates around the abdomen, these signals become louder and more disruptive. They increase insulin resistance, elevate inflammatory markers, and place constant pressure on the arteries. This is why cardiovascular risk rises even when blood sugar appears only moderately elevated. The body is carrying an internal burden that quietly reshapes metabolism. Insulin resistance does not begin in the pancreas. It develops in tissues that have lost their ability to respond calmly to insulin's message. Muscle, liver, and fat cells become less cooperative, requiring more insulin to achieve the same effect. This forces the pancreas to work harder, flooding the bloodstream with insulin in an attempt to maintain balance. Over time, this state accelerates fat storage, worsens inflammation, and deepens metabolic stress. The arteries feel this strain indirectly, as inflammatory signals and altered lipid metabolism increase their vulnerability to damage. Walnuts influence this process not by triggering rapid weight loss, but by restoring a sense of nutritional completeness. Their unique combination of healthy fats, fiber, and plant protein activates satiety signals in the brain, particularly those associated with fullness and satisfaction. When these signals are engaged, the drive to overconsume refined, inflammatory foods naturally diminishes. The body feels fed, not just filled. This distinction matters deeply, because constant hunger and cravings are signs of metabolic imbalance, not personal failure. As calorie intake stabilizes and food quality improves, fat tissue begins to behave differently. Inflammatory signaling decreases, and insulin sensitivity improves incrementally. Even modest reductions in abdominal fat can lead to meaningful changes in how the body processes glucose and lipids. Walnuts support this shift by providing energy that does not provoke insulin spikes, allowing fat metabolism to proceed without constant interruption. The body is no longer forced to store aggressively. It can begin to release and rebalance. There is also an important hormonal dimension to consider. Excess fat disrupts hormones involved in appetite regulation, such as leptin, which tells the brain when enough energy has been consumed. In insulin-resistant states, leptin signaling becomes impaired, leading to overeating even when energy stores are abundant. Walnuts, through their nutrient density, help recalibrate this signaling. They deliver essential fatty acids and micronutrients that restore sensitivity to fullness cues, allowing the brain and body to communicate more clearly. This improved communication has downstream effects on blood vessels. As insulin sensitivity improves, insulin can once again perform its vascular role, promoting nitric oxide production and supporting healthy blood flow. When insulin resistance dominates, this protective effect is lost, and arteries become stiffer and more reactive. By easing insulin resistance through improved body composition and metabolic signaling, walnuts indirectly support vascular flexibility. The arteries are no longer exposed to the constant biochemical stress associated with metabolic overload. Another layer of this process involves chronic low-grade inflammation. Fat tissue, especially when enlarged, releases inflammatory compounds that circulate throughout the body. These compounds damage the endothelium and accelerate plaque formation. Walnuts contain bioactive compounds that counteract this inflammatory output, reducing the intensity of these signals. The result is a quieter internal environment, one in which repair can begin to outpace damage. Inflammation does not disappear, but it loses its dominance. What makes this influence particularly sustainable is that it does not rely on restriction or deprivation. The body responds poorly to constant denial, often rebounding with increased hunger and metabolic slowdown. Walnuts work with physiology rather than against it. They satisfy energy needs while gently steering the body toward balance. Over time, this cooperation leads to changes that feel natural rather than forced, supporting long-term improvements in weight regulation and insulin sensitivity. As insulin resistance softens and inflammatory pressure decreases, the burden on arteries lightens. Blood becomes less reactive, lipid particles behave more predictably, and the vessel walls experience fewer assaults. This is not a dramatic transformation, but a steady recalibration. The body shifts from a state of defense to one of maintenance. For individuals with diabetes, this shift can slow the progression of vascular damage and preserve arterial function for years longer than expected. In this way, walnuts contribute to arterial health by addressing one of the most overlooked drivers of damage, the metabolic strain created by excess fat and impaired insulin signaling. They do not promise rapid change, but they support the conditions under which meaningful change becomes possible. Through satiety, hormonal balance, and reduced inflammation, they help the body release its grip on stress and return to a more resilient, responsive state where arteries are protected not by force, but by restored balance. Healing in the human body rarely begins with force. It begins with signals, subtle messages that tell cells whether they are in danger or in safety. Every meal sends one of these messages. In diabetes, the internal environment often feels hostile, marked by elevated glucose, oxidative stress, and chronic inflammation. Under these conditions, the body shifts into defense mode. Blood vessels tighten, immune responses intensify, and repair mechanisms slow, not because the body has failed, but because it believes it must protect itself from ongoing harm. Walnuts function within this language of signaling rather than intervention. They are not perceived as an emergency input, but as a familiar, nourishing presence. Their fatty acids integrate into cell membranes, making them more flexible and responsive. Their antioxidants reduce oxidative noise in the bloodstream. Their minerals quietly support enzymatic processes involved in repair. Together, these elements create a biochemical message that says the environment is supportive, not threatening. When cells receive this message repeatedly, their behavior changes. Arteries, in particular, are sensitive to these signals. The endothelium responds not only to physical pressure, but to the chemical tone of the blood. When that tone is inflammatory, vessels stiffen and become less adaptive. When the tone is calm, they regain elasticity. Walnuts help lower the volume of inflammatory messengers while increasing the presence of compounds associated with repair and balance. Over time, this shifts arterial behavior from reactivity to responsiveness. This concept reframes how we think about clearing arteries. The body does not have a mechanism to scrape plaque away like residue from a surface. Instead, it manages plaque through remodeling, stabilization, and gradual regression when conditions allow. Walnuts contribute to these conditions by reducing oxidative stress and supporting healthy lipid behavior. Plaques that are less inflamed and more stable are less likely to rupture and more likely to remain integrated into the vessel wall. This is a form of protection that operates quietly, without dramatic markers, but with profound implications for long-term cardiovascular health. There is also a neurological aspect to this process. The brain monitors nutrient intake and adjusts autonomic responses accordingly. Diets high in inflammatory foods activate stress pathways, increasing sympathetic nervous system activity. This leads to higher blood pressure and increased vascular strain. Walnuts, by contrast, are associated with improved autonomic balance, favoring parasympathetic activity, the branch of the nervous system associated with rest and repair. This shift reduces vascular tension and supports more stable blood flow. The gut plays an essential role in translating food into systemic signals. Walnuts nourish beneficial gut bacteria that produce compounds influencing inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and vascular function. These microbial byproducts enter the circulation and interact with blood vessels, further reinforcing a state of metabolic calm. This gut-mediated signaling is slow but powerful, shaping how the body interprets and responds to daily nourishment. What makes this particularly meaningful for people with diabetes is that the disease often carries a psychological burden alongside the physical one. The constant monitoring, the fear of complications, and the pressure to control numbers can create chronic stress. Stress itself worsens vascular health, increasing inflammation and blood pressure. Foods that support a sense of nourishment and satisfaction can reduce this stress response. Walnuts, through their texture, flavor, and satiety, contribute to a feeling of care rather than restriction. This emotional response is not separate from biology. It directly influences hormonal and inflammatory pathways. Over time, repeated exposure to these supportive signals encourages the body to invest energy in maintenance rather than emergency response. Repair enzymes function more efficiently. Endothelial cells regenerate more effectively. The balance between damage and repair shifts slightly, but meaningfully, in favor of preservation. This is how long-term arterial health is maintained, not through sudden change, but through consistent reinforcement of safety signals. In this context, walnuts are less a food and more a conversation with the body. They speak the language of nourishment, balance, and trust. They remind the system that it can relax, that it does not need to brace for constant insult. For arteries strained by years of metabolic stress, this message can be transformative. It allows flexibility to return, inflammation to subside, and the natural processes of remodeling and stabilization to proceed without interruption. Through this gentle but persistent signaling, the body is given the space to protect and preserve its vital pathways, supporting circulation not by clearing with force, but by restoring the internal conditions in which health can quietly reemerge.